I once saw a boy carry an unconscious man through a storm blood on the man's forehead, and then vanish without asking for a thing. 7 years later, that man stood in a boardroom and said, "That boy saved this entire empire." If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Subscribe now so you don't miss more soul-touching story films like this. It all started beneath a rusted roof and a rain that wouldn't stop. The sun had barely risen over the rust-colored rooftops of Kumasi when Kai opened his eyes to the sound of bus engines rumbling to life. The boy didn't flinch. He'd long grown used to the sound of diesel coughing through cracked exhaust pipes, the buzz of market women setting up their stalls, and the faint scent of fried yin drifting from street corners. This wasn't a gentle awakening. It was survival's daily alarm clock. Kai was 13, or so he guessed. He had no birth certificate, no mother to remind him what day he entered the world, no father to mark his height against the wall. He had no wall, only the back of a broken-down Benz bus parked permanently near the far end of the Kumasi lorry station. That was his shelter. That was his home. He sat up slowly, brushing dried leaves and a torn rice sack off his chest. The night had been cruel. Cold air had snuck into every corner of his bones. His feet were bare, cracked at the heels. His t-shirt, once white, was now a canvas of stains, dirt oil, maybe blood. No one cared enough to ask. He didn't care to explain. From a worn plastic bag, Kai pulled out an empty bottle and a small scrap of paper with the word "Hope" scribbled in charcoal. He stared at the word like it was a spell, a reminder that things might one day change, that maybe the world wasn't finished with him yet. He folded the paper neatly and tucked it inside his shirt pocket before grabbing the rusty tin bowl he used as a collection tray. Another day had begun. The station was already alive. Women shouted prices of fried plantains. Taxi drivers cursed each other over parking space. An old man with no teeth sang something about freedom as he pushed a wheelbarrow full of spoiled bananas. No one noticed Kai weaving through them, quiet as a shadow. No one asked his name. His first stop was the market dumpster's metal bins that smelled of rot and desperation. He bent down his fingers quick and practiced, sorting through wilted cabbage leaves, half-eaten mangoes, and used sachets of water. He knew which vendor dumped edible waste early. He had learned patterns, timings, the way some stalls clung to dignity, while others gave scraps with guilt in their eyes. Behind the tomato seller's booth, he found a piece of half-eaten bread, hard, slightly green at the edge. He sniffed it, shrugged, and dropped it into the tin bowl. "Boy, don't touch that!" a voice barked from above. He looked up to see a muscular man, a vendor with a plastic apron stained with palm oil. The man held a cleaver and a scowl. "I saw that first," the vendor growled. "You think this market's your kitchen?" Kai didn't argue. He never argued. He knew that tone, that look. He simply backed away, still clutching the bread in his hand, eyes down, dignity tucked deep inside him. He wandered through the bus rows, next, checking between tires and under benches for plastic bottles. 2 here, 1 there. A lucky score near the trot row stand, a big Coke bottle still half full. He looked around before raising it to his lips. The liquid was warm, flat, and tasted faintly of soap. But it was sugar. It was something. A boy his age passed by whistling a school bag, bouncing on his back. The boy didn't see Kai. Or maybe he did, and chose not to. Kai stared after him. For a second, his body paused in time. There was a pang, a sharp, invisible pinch in his chest. School. He remembered it. Faintly. Chalkboard lessons. A woman who once braided his hair and taught him to spell his name. He didn't remember her face anymore. Just the softness in her hands and the smell of oranges. He shook the thought away. The day was warming. Heat rose from the concrete. The buses groaned and rolled. The city stretched its limbs, indifferent to boys like him. Kai continued his rounds, moving with the rhythm of someone who had been doing this all his life. His eyes scanned gutters for dropped coins. He had found one once, 5 pesewas, and bought a boiled egg. That day had felt like a feast. Near the back of the station, he spotted an old woman selling kenki. Her stand was shaded by an umbrella that leaned like it had given up. She was kneeling arranging peppers in a rusted bowl. Kai hesitated, then approached, slowly holding his tin bowl forward with both hands. "Auntie," he said gently, "do you have any kenki pieces you're not using?" She looked up, her face unreadable. For a second, silence passed between them. "Are you the one who stole my salt last week?" she asked sharply. "No, Auntie, I don't steal." She narrowed her eyes, then scoffed. "All of you say the same. Dirty fingers, lying mouths." He stood there unmoving. Eventually, with a sigh, she tossed a small piece of leftover kenki into his bowl. It landed with a dull thud. "Don't let me see you here again," she muttered. Kai nodded gratefully and stepped away. That was lunch, maybe dinner too. By noon, the station was louder, hotter. Kai retreated to the shaded side where the breeze smelled less of smoke and more of dust. He sat on the edge of a broken bench, unwrapped his meal, and ate slowly, savoring every bite like it was a sacred act. Children ran nearby, chasing each other with tire rims. Laughter echoed. Kai didn't join. He rarely did. He watched them with a strange mix of joy and ache, wanting their freedom, fearing their rejection. He finished eating and lay back on the bench, the tin bowl resting on his stomach, his eyes scanning the clouds. One looked like a kite, another like a lion. He smiled faintly. "Kai," a familiar voice called. He sat up. It was Amma, a girl 2 years older, wearing a red scarf and a baby on her back. She sold roasted corn near the station. Her baby's eyes always looked tired, like they understood too much. "You want the cobs from this morning?" she asked, holding up a small bag. Kai nodded quickly. She tossed them over. "They're dry, though." "I don't mind," he said, already reaching for them. "Have you eaten today?" He shrugged. Amma stared at him, then walked away. She had her own battles. Her kindness had limits. Kai understood. He picked through the cobs, biting at the edges for any kernel that hadn't been scorched. Later, he returned to his bus, the shell of his home. He crawled inside, laying out his collection of bottles beside him. 12 bottles. Maybe he could trade them for 2 cedis. Maybe. He traced the letters on his scrap paper again. Hope. It had come from a woman long ago, someone who'd handed him a sweet after church and said, "Never forget this word." He hadn't. He kept it even when he forgot her face. Inside the bus, the air was still. The world outside moved on. Sellers yelling, children crying, men drinking pito and shouting politics. No one looked his way. No one ever did. Sometimes he wondered if he was invisible. If maybe he had died once quietly in a corner somewhere, and now was just floating through the station, waiting for someone to see him, really see him. He didn't cry. He rarely did. Tears felt like weakness, and weakness was dangerous. Instead, he closed his eyes and imagined a different day. One where he woke up in a real bed, where someone said his name not to chase him away, but to welcome him. One where he didn't have to measure his worth in bottles and leftover bread. Sleep pulled at him gentle and harsh. Outside, the wind picked up. A storm was building in the distance. Thick clouds gathered like dark memories. The air shifted. Somewhere far off, thunder growled. Kai didn't move. The rain would come soon. He would be ready. He always was. He reached to the corner of the bus and pulled out his most treasured possession. A worn, faded raincoat, once bright blue, now a patchwork of stitches and hope. The plastic was torn in places and the zipper long gone. But to Kai, it was armor. He folded it neatly across his lap and whispered to himself, "Not tonight." The rain began to fall, first soft, then hard. The tin roof above him shuddered with every drop. The city groaned under the storm. And still Kai sat in the dark, alone, wrapped in blue. His eyes were closed, but his heart was awake, waiting. The sky cracked open like glass under pressure. It had started with whispers. Small, scattered raindrops that danced on the rusted metal roofs of Kumasi's bus station. The air grew heavy, pregnant with electricity and an eerie stillness, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Then came the thunder, deep booming like the angry voice of an ancient god. Within moments, the rain unleashed itself with fury. Vendors scrambled to throw tarps over their wares. Mothers pulled their children by the arms, dashing toward whatever shade they could find. Drivers rolled up their windows. Corn husks blew through the wind like lost birds. The station turned chaotic. People shoved, cursed, slipped, and shouted. Kumasi under rain was not romantic, it was survival under siege. Kai stood still in the storm. His tiny figure, soaked to the bone, looked like a misplaced note in a song played too loud. The rain hit his skin like slaps, sharp and cold, but he didn't flinch. His feet, bare and blistered, sank into the thickening mud as the ground beneath him turned into a churned mess of trash water and lost coins. He had been on his way to crawl into the back of the Benz bus, the only place that gave a sliver of shelter. But something stopped him. A flash of movement, not from a person running, but from someone not moving at all. Under a makeshift zinc awning near the edge of the loading bay, someone had collapsed. Kai squinted through the rain. It wasn't unusual to see drunk men passed out in the gutters. But this felt different. The body wasn't slumped like someone sleeping off akbateshi. It was sprawled unnaturally still. Arms twisted, one leg bent awkwardly. The man's head rested on the edge of a low curb. Blood, a thin line of it, trailed from his temple and mingled with the rain, becoming one with the muddy earth. Kai hesitated. People were running past. A man dropped a basket of oranges beside the body, cursed, then picked them up and kept moving. No one stopped. No one looked twice. To them, he was just another inconvenience, another broken thing in a city filled with them. Kai took one shaky step forward. His heart thumped wildly, not from fear of the storm, but from something deeper. A sense of urgency. A whisper in his bones, telling him this wasn't normal, that this man wasn't just drunk or sleeping. He was dying. Another step, and another. He reached the man, crouched low. His knees sinking into the mud. The man was middle-aged, maybe in his 40s. His clothes, though soaked and torn, looked expensive, or at least had been. A dark blazer bloodied at the sleeve. A wristwatch cracked but gold-plated. His face was strong but pale now, lifeless. His eyes were shut lashes blinking weakly against the rain. Sir Kai said, voice trembling. No response. Kai touched his shoulder, gently shaking. Sir, can you hear me? The man groaned, a soft, barely there sound, but enough to tell Kai he was still alive. And then the boy made a decision. It was reckless. It was dangerous, but it was right. Kai reached into his shirt and pulled out the only valuable thing he had, his blue raincoat. It wasn't much anymore. Torn near the sides, the zipper barely worked and the color had faded into a sea-washed gray in places. But to Kai, it was memory. It was armor. It had kept him dry on the worst nights when wind pierced through broken buses and the rain sang lullabies of sorrow. He had patched it with fishing wire and tape guarded it like treasure. He had never given it to anyone, until now. With shaking fingers, Kai draped the raincoat over the man's chest, tucking it under his arms like a blanket. The man shivered but remained unconscious. Kai looked around, hoping, praying someone would come help. Help, he called, not loudly, but enough to be heard. No one came. He raised his voice. This man is hurt. Still nothing. Only rain and movement. Everyone was too busy saving themselves. Kai crouched for another moment, staring at the stranger. Then he whispered more to himself than to the man. I can't leave you. He rose to his feet, wiping water from his eyes. Then he bent down, slipped his arms under the man's shoulders, and began to lift. The weight hit him like bricks. The man was heavy, too heavy for Kai's frame. His knees buckled, but he didn't fall. He gritted his teeth, adjusted the position, and forced the man upright. The blood smeared onto his chest. The man's head lolled against his shoulder. Kai staggered. For a second, he almost dropped him. But then the image of the man dying alone flashed across his mind, and his grip tightened. One step, then another. He began the long walk through the storm. The road to the clinic was over 3 kilometers away, past the market district, through alleyways that smelled of sewage and shame, across a narrow bridge, where goats huddled under abandoned umbrellas. Kai didn't think of the distance. He thought of breath, keeping the man's chest rising, keeping his feet moving. Each step was agony. The mud sucked at his soles like quicksand. Lightning split the sky in jagged white scars. The man groaned once, his body twitching, then slumped again. Kai's arms burned. His shoulders screamed, but he didn't stop. Halfway through the second kilometer, his vision blurred. Not from rain, but from fever. The days without real food, the wet clothes clinging to his frail body, the exhaustion, it all caught up to him. His head spun. He nearly fell. But then he remembered the word in his pocket, hope, and he kept going. Twice he slipped knees, slamming into gravel. Once he dropped to both hands, the man nearly tumbling from his grasp. But somehow, someway, he managed to lift again. Move again. People stared. A few stepped aside, but no one helped. To them, he was a dirty boy carrying another broken man. Maybe a thief. Maybe a nuisance. Maybe invisible. But he was none of those things. He was a savior. By the time he reached the entrance of the roadside clinic, Kai could barely breathe. His body shook from cold and strain. The man in his arms was still unconscious, skin cold as stone. He banged on the clinic gate with his elbow, shouting hoarsely. A nurse opened the door, her expression skeptical, until she saw the man. "Oh my God," she gasped, rushing to help. "What happened?" I found him," Kai whispered, barely able to stand. He was bleeding. I couldn't leave him." The world tilted. His legs buckled. And finally, after holding on for what felt like eternity, Kai collapsed. The rain fell harder as the nurses pulled the man into the building. One reached out to Kai, calling his name, but he was already unconscious. The antiseptic air inside the clinic was a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm outside. Rain drummed violently against the metal roof, sounding like distant gunfire. The lights flickered once weakly, then stabilized with a dull hum. In the far room, the man lay motionless on a steel-framed hospital bed, hooked to a thin IV line that pulsed steadily with life. Gauze was wrapped around his head, the bandage already blotched with brownish red. His skin was a pale shade of clay cold, but no longer fading. He was breathing now, slow and shallow, but consistent. A nurse leaned over him, checking his pulse, muttering vitals to herself. Beside her, the matron nurse Gifty watched quietly. She was a broad-shouldered woman with soft eyes and a jaw carved from discipline. Nothing in the clinic happened without her knowing. Nothing happened here without a reason. But this was different. She had seen many things in her years. Accidents, overdoses, heartbreaks, wrapped in torn shirts. But never had a boy carried a full-grown man on his back through a storm like death itself was chasing them both. And then, after collapsing, refused a blanket, refused food. And when the man had stabilized, vanished, without a word, without a name, just like a ghost with a heartbeat. She looked over her shoulder toward the empty hallway where the boy had last stood. She would never forget those eyes, wide, haunted, shimmering with something she couldn't quite place. Not fear, not sadness, something older, deeper. Like the boy had lived 100 years in the rain. At 4:06 a.m. the man stirred, first his fingers, then a cough ragged and low. Nurse Gifty was by his side in seconds, motioning for the others to stay back. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and leaned close. "Sir, you're safe. You're in a clinic near Ayigya. You were hurt. You lost a lot of blood, but you're going to be all right." The man blinked. His lips moved dry and slow, forming no words at first. Then he rasped, "Where am I?" I said Ayigya, outskirts of Kumasi. His gaze darted around the room, disoriented. He looked at the IV line, the bandage, the ceiling fans spinning sluggishly above them. Who brought me here? Who? She hesitated. "A boy," she said finally. "Young, barely a teenager. He found you under a zinc awning unconscious. He carried you here, in the rain." The man's brow furrowed. He winced, lifting a hand to his head. I don't remember." "That's okay," she said softly, checking his pupils. "Head trauma does that. Temporary memory loss is common. It might come back." slowly, bits and pieces. He stared at the ceiling. I don't know who I am. Gifty's hand froze mid-motion. She stepped back, her voice suddenly cautious. You don't remember your name? No. Where you live? No. Family, friends, a phone number, anything. The man blinked. Silence. Then he whispered there was a boy in blue. She leaned forward. A boy. He closed his eyes, as if trying to reach into the fog of his own mind. A raincoat. Blue. He looked at me. I remember his eyes. So young, but not afraid. Gifty's throat tightened. Yes, that was him. Kai. The boy who'd stood dripping in rainwater arms, trembling face set in quiet fire. She remembered how he had refused to sit, refused even the cup of tea one of the nurses had offered. He'd stood beside the stranger's bed, silent and vigilant, like a soldier who'd sworn an oath he couldn't name. And when they told him the man would live, he nodded once, then turned and walked out the door like he'd never existed. Do you know him? The man asked, voice thinner now. Gifty shook her head. No. He didn't leave a name. He didn't want thanks. Then why would he help me? I asked myself that too. She adjusted the IV, her hands steady. I've worked in this clinic for 15 years, she continued. I've seen people die because no one would stop to help. Because strangers walk past bleeding men like stepping over broken glass. But that boy, he chose not to. The man stared at her. His eyes were sharp despite the confusion. There was strength behind the fog. What kind of boy does that? The kind we don't deserve, she said. At sunrise, the rain had lessened to a drizzle. The clouds hung low, reluctant to leave. Morning vendors returned to the streets with damp bags and short tempers. A few travelers stood in line for trotros. Life was slowly breathing again. Kai was gone. Gifty walked out to the street and scanned the faces. She asked two nearby shop owners if they had seen a boy with no shoes and a torn shirt. One said maybe. The other shrugged. Too many like that, he muttered. You'll go mad trying to count them. She didn't argue. It was true. In Kumasi, the forgotten ones were everywhere. Lurking behind bus stations, crawling into abandoned stalls, gathering near night fires with empty bellies and eyes like cracked mirrors. But this one had been different. That night, something had shifted. Gifty returned inside and checked on the patient. He had drifted back to sleep, a line of sweat on his brow, lips twitching as if caught between two worlds. She pulled up a chair and sat beside him. Outside, the city roared back to life. But in that small room, there was only the beeping of machines, the steady drip of saline, and the whisper of a memory. A boy in a blue raincoat standing in a storm, choosing to carry a stranger on his back. A boy who left no trace, except in the heart of a man who had nothing but his face in his mind, and in the mind of a nurse who could not forget. Kwabena Mensah was not a name. It was a force. For nearly 2 decades, his name had rippled through boardrooms, echoed in stock tickers, and hummed through underground fiber-optic cables that fed Ghana's modern voice. CEO of BrightStream Communications, the nation's largest and most influential telecommunications empire, Kwabena had built his kingdom from ash and ambition. He wasn't born rich. That his enemies always forgot. Kwabena had risen from the alleys of Sekondi, clawing his way through overcrowded public schools, selling plantains on street corners, and earning a scholarship to study electrical engineering in South Africa. From there, his rise had been meteoric. A systems engineer at age 22, a network architect by 25, and a self-made mogul by 35. He didn't just own towers, he built them. He didn't chase the future, he designed it. But the world didn't see the engineer anymore. They saw the tailored suits, the diplomatic ties, the black Range Rover that never stopped at red lights. His voice had become gospel in the corridors of policy. His signature could move entire departments, and he knew it. What they didn't know was that Kwabena had a habit. He disappeared once a month. No press, no guards, no cameras, just him, in a cap, in a borrowed truck. Delivering medical supplies to clinics that didn't appear on Google Maps, handing out SIM cards to kids who had never made a phone call, listening to fishermen who still believed their radios whispered spirits from the ocean. It was his penance, his reminder, that he had once needed help and now had the power to give it. And it was on one of these silent pilgrimages, unmarked, undocumented, that Kwabena Mensah disappeared. The news didn't break because it was never made public. He had left Accra in the early morning hours, wearing jeans and a plain shirt. He told no one, not even his driver. He carried 2 boxes of equipment in the back of a rental pickup and drove alone toward the Ashanti region. His destination, a newly built solar-powered community center in Ejisu. He never made it there. What happened between mile marker 217 and the Kumasi station remained a mystery. A slick turn, a reckless motorbike. No cameras, no witnesses. By the time the blood dried on the side of his head, no one knew who he was. His wallet had fallen somewhere in the mud. The phone in his pocket was soaked and dead, and his memory gone, all of it. A man without a past, lying in a clinic on the edge of town, alive, only because a barefoot boy had refused to look away. Meanwhile, back in Accra, BrightStream buzzed. At first, the absence was manageable. Kwabena had often gone dark for 12, sometimes even 24 hours. His assistant Abena chalked it up to CEO business, the kind that didn't require explanation. He was known for unpredictability, and no one questioned it. But by the second day, whispers began. By the third, meetings were postponed. Proposals piled up. Division heads grew nervous. International partners sent emails flagged urgent. The board members called emergency sessions behind closed doors. And on the 4th day, Abena did something she had never done before. She called Owusu. Martin Owusu, the vice president of corporate strategy, the man who never blinked. Owusu had sharp features, skin like polished ebony, and a demeanor that made interns freeze mid-step. He had been Kwabena's number 2 for 6 years, a silent shadow in quarterly reports and budget presentations. His voice was smooth, deliberate, always an octave below confrontation. He spoke in numbers, not poetry. He wore suits stitched by tailors who didn't advertise. And he waited. He had always waited for the empire to wobble, and now it had. When he entered the boardroom that morning, the temperature shifted. Executives adjusted their ties. Department heads leaned forward. They wanted leadership, direction, a spine. He gave them certainty. Mr. Mensah, Owusu said calmly, is currently incapacitated due to personal health reasons. The nature of his condition is being evaluated, and we ask for your cooperation during this interim transition. No one asked how he knew that. No one asked where the CEO was. Owusu's tone didn't invite questions, it assumed obedience. And in that moment, the first crack formed. Over the next week, BrightStream changed. Slightly at first, then sharply. Internal memos were rerouted. Legal teams began reviewing contracts without board oversight. The PR department issued a vague statement about Kwabena taking a reflective sabbatical citing burnout, without quoting anyone by name. Several department heads who had once enjoyed Kwabena's protection found themselves reassigned or on extended leave. And Owusu's name began appearing on clearance memos and vendor approvals, things that were previously untouchable. Abena tried to contact him again. He responded with a 3-word email, stay in line. Rumors swirled that Kwabena had resigned, that he had a breakdown, that he had fled the country with public funds. A whisper campaign seeped through the office hallways, poisoning trust, making silence feel safe, and speculation feel like survival. No one mentioned the truth that no one had seen Kwabena Mensah in over 10 days. No one except one boy. And he had disappeared too. Owusu sat in the CEO's office on the 12th floor. He didn't redecorate. Not yet. But he had the couch reupholstered in ash gray and swapped the ficus plant for a bonsai tree. He stood behind the glass wall that overlooked the skyline of Accra, sipping from a tumbler of imported scotch. You built the machine, he muttered. I'll drive it. He wasn't a villain, not in his own mind. Kwabena had vision, sure. But vision without legacy was ego. Owusu had plans. He would take BrightStream global, outsource operations to Dubai, streamline fiber contracts, sell minority stakes to Chinese partners with silent capital. The board would thank him. They always did. He returned to the desk and tapped a locked folder on his laptop to initiative abort. Then he picked up his phone and called legal. I want to fast-track the restructuring. I'll be stepping in as acting CEO effective Monday. There was a pause on the other end. Sir, the board hasn't... I said Monday. Back in Kumasi, Kwabena sat on a hospital bed staring at his reflection in a scratched mirror. He still didn't know his name, but in his sleep he saw flashes. A tower, a woman crying on a cracked phone, a conference room, and always, those eyes. The boy in the storm, the blue raincoat. He didn't know what any of it meant, but somewhere far away his name was being erased, and power was changing hands. 7 years changes a city, but not always a life. The Kumasi skyline had grown, rising like stubborn weeds through concrete. New hotels, neon billboards, and a freshly painted flyover sliced through the old districts like a scar on a familiar face. Minibuses buzzed louder. Markets swelled with knockoff tech and faded dreams. The city moved faster now, demanding more, giving less. But not much had changed for Kai. At 20, his shoulders had broadened, his voice had deepened, but his eyes... those eyes were still carved from the same silence, the same steady fire that once burned beneath a blue raincoat. He lived in a settlement called Asuboy Stretch, a forgotten patch of land behind a garbage transfer site on the edge of town. They called it a residential area on maps, but no one with a title deed lived there. Just stray goats, restless men, and shanties stitched from sheet metal and stubbornness. Kai's home was a one-room corrugated tin shack no bigger than a janitor's closet. A mattress pressed against one wall. A plastic basin beside it. A cracked radio that hadn't played since last Christmas. On the wall above his bed, wrapped in a thin plastic cover, hung the only item he owned that had never touched the ground, the old faded blue raincoat. Time had not been kind to it. The threads frayed. The zipper was permanently stuck. There were bloodstains that hadn't washed out, and tears where the seams had surrendered. But Kai never let it go. He didn't wear it anymore, not since the day he realized it no longer fit his arms. But he cleaned it every month, folded it carefully, and hung it like a flag over his existence. That coat was memory. That coat was proof that once in a storm he had mattered. Most mornings Kai rose before the sun. The air in Asuboy was sharp before dawn, filled with the cries of waking chickens and the metallic stench of burning plastic. He washed his face with cold water from a shared bucket outside, brushed his teeth with charcoal and salt, and packed his tools into a second-hand backpack patched at the corners. He was an electrician now, well, a fixer, as the neighborhood called him. No formal training, no certificates. Just a screwdriver, a voltage tester, and a mind that remembered how wires talk to each other. His first job that morning was a single bulb in a shop kiosk down by the bus stop. The woman paid him with a loaf of bread and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Business slow?" he asked gently. She laughed dryly. "Business dead." He nodded. They understood each other. By midday, sweat clung to his body like a second skin. He worked through a power outage on a circuit box in a tailor's stall, got shocked twice by a loose ground wire, and missed lunch. Again, he didn't mind. Hunger was an old friend, persistent but predictable. On his way home, he passed by a small drugstore, its faded sign creaking in the wind. Inside, a frail man sat slumped in a wooden chair, coughing into a handkerchief spotted with blood. Kai hesitated. This was Mr. Addo, his neighbor in the next shack. Once a proud primary school teacher, now reduced to bones and wheezing. Tuberculosis, most likely. The clinic had prescribed antibiotics, but the prescription sat unpaid on the counter. The pharmacist looked at Kai with a raised brow. 2 CDs, she said flatly. Kai reached into his pocket. He had 3 CDs left, just enough for rice and stew, his first proper meal in 2 days. He stared at the coins, his stomach twisted. Then, without a word, he slid the money across the counter and walked out with the pills. He didn't need applause. He didn't even wait for thanks. Just the small nod from Mr. Addo, eyes, misty hand trembling, that was enough. That night, he ate dry gurry soaked in water, and still he smiled. Life in Asuboy was not defined by big tragedies. It was the little ones that wore you down. Rain that leaked through your roof. Rats that chewed your bread. Days when your phone had no credit, and the only number you remembered was your own. Kai knew struggle like others knew scripture. But he never bowed to it. He never cursed the sky or envied the rich. He kept moving one wire at a time, one neighbor at a time. There was pride in usefulness. There was dignity in showing up. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Kai sat on an overturned paint bucket outside his shack, staring at the horizon. His hands were blistered from rewiring a broken fridge that afternoon. His shirt was stained with engine grease, but his mind was somewhere else. He reached into the folds of his bedding and pulled out a small tin box. Inside was a folded page from an old newspaper now yellowed and fragile. It had a headline from 7 years ago. BrightStream CEO still missing. Company silent on whereabouts. He'd found it months after the rainstorm. Someone had thrown it out, and he'd pulled it from a trash bin behind a copy shop. He had read the article 1,000 times. They never mentioned the blue raincoat. Never mentioned the clinic. Never mentioned the boy who carried a stranger through a storm. But Kai knew. He knew who that man was. He had no proof, no photo, no reward. Only the memory of a weight against his back, the blood on his collar, the way the man's breath rattled like old leaves. Sometimes he wondered if the man had survived. If he ever remembered. If he ever looked for the boy in the blue coat. But then he would fold the paper again and tuck it back into the box and whisper it doesn't matter, because he hadn't done it to be remembered. He had done it because no one else did. That same night, a knock came at his door. 3 short raps. Unusual. No one knocked in Asuboy. They called from outside or just pushed the door open. Kai rose wary. He opened it to find a young girl, maybe 9 or 10, panting her eyes wide with panic. Mama says the wires are sparking. Please come. He didn't ask for payment. He grabbed his tools and ran. The world needed fixing, and he knew how. As he worked that evening, crouched beside a panel, half hidden in the dark, the girl stood beside him. She didn't speak for a long time. Then quietly she said, "Is it true you saved someone in the rain once?" He froze, then looked at her expression unreadable. "Who told you that?" "Uncle Addo," she said. "He said you carried a big man through a storm." Kai smiled softly. "I was just there," he said. "That's all." She nodded like she understood. Like she knew that sometimes being there was everything. And back in Accra, far from the fires and faults of Asuboy, a man stood staring at an old raincoat behind glass. His memory still fractured, but his eyes didn't lie. He was starting to remember, and soon he would begin to search. The call came in the late afternoon. Just as Kai was packing up his tools after rewiring a flickering outlet in a rundown internet cafe on the edge of Asafo. He barely heard the voice. Over the static, the man on the other end spoke in crisp, clipped English with an accent that sounded like it belonged to glass towers and air-conditioned boardrooms. "You're the electrician, yes?" the voice asked. Kai hesitated, then answered, "Yes, sir. We were told you're discreet. Reliable. We need someone tonight. Urgent." The man didn't ask Kai's name, didn't ask for references, just an address and a time. When Kai hung up, something buzzed in his chest. Not quite fear, not quite excitement. A hum, a pull. Something strange. The address? East Ridge, the rich side of Accra, where homes had gates taller than trees, where guards carried pistols instead of batons, and where even the shadows looked like they had degrees. Kai had never worked there, never even imagined it. But something about the way the man had spoken flat, urgent, formal, told him this wasn't a prank. He cleaned his tools, carefully changed his shirt, and caught the last trotro heading south. As the bus rumbled through the dusty arteries of the city, Kai stared out the window, heart ticking in a rhythm he didn't understand. He didn't know what waited for him, only that something had shifted, and tonight would not be like the others. The house was nothing short of a fortress, perched at the end of a private street with no name. The mansion rose from behind black steel gates like a quiet cathedral. Cream-colored walls, tall palm trees flanking either side. No nameplate, no fancy decor. Just clean geometry, quiet wealth, and silence. A security guard approached as Kai stepped off the street. He was expecting to be turned away. Instead, the guard nodded once, then opened the pedestrian gate. No questions, no frisking. As if Kai had already been cleared long before he arrived. He walked the long cobblestone path, slowly passing a fountain shaped like a lion's head. Lights flickered behind thick glass windows. Somewhere inside, he could hear classical music playing softly notes that fluttered like leaves in still air. Kai paused at the main door and raised a hand to knock, but it opened before he could. And standing there was a man, tall, handsome, silver in his hair, a scar near the temple faint but undeniable, eyes sharp enough to slice through smoke. And for a moment Kai's world tilted. He had seen this face before, once long ago, covered in blood-cold rain and silence. Kwabena Mensah, alive, whole, watching him. And then Kwabena spoke. "You're early," he said simply, voice calm. Kai swallowed. The man on the phone said it was urgent. Kwabena's eyes lingered on him for a beat too long. Yes, it is." He stepped aside. "Come in." The inside of the house was everything the outside promised. Sleek floors, mahogany beams, walls lined with abstract paintings that probably cost more than Kai had earned in his entire life. But none of it was loud. No gold, no marble, just taste and power woven so tightly they became invisible. Kai kept his eyes low as he followed. Kwabena led him through a long hallway past a kitchen that smelled faintly of ginger and garlic into a living room where a small breaker panel had been removed from the wall. "There's a problem with the backup line," Kwabena said, pointing. "It trips randomly. No one's been able to fix it." Kai nodded slowly, crouching beside the wires, his hands already moving on instinct. But he could feel the weight of Kwabena's gaze on the back of his neck. Not suspicion, recognition. Kwabena said nothing, but his breath had hitched the moment he saw Kai's face. And that voice had echoed in his dreams for years. The boy in the rain, the voice whispering, "You'll be okay, sir. Don't die. Please don't die." Kai worked quietly, professionally. He didn't look up, didn't ask questions. But his palms were sweating. His chest was tight. Every minute felt like a rope pulled taut. When he finally stood wiping dust from his hands, Kwabena was still watching. "It's done," Kai said, avoiding his eyes. The neutral wire was loose. The grounding line had corrosion. Kwabena nodded. "I knew you'd fix it." Kai blinked. "Excuse me." Kwabena walked to a cabinet in the corner, opened it, and took out a small box. He walked back slow and measured and held it out. Kai frowned. The lid was lifted. Inside, perfectly folded, was a blue raincoat. Old, faded, patched with fishing wire. Kai's breath caught. "I kept it," Kwabena said softly, "even when I didn't know why. Even when I didn't know my own name. It was the one thing that felt real." Kai's mouth went dry. His hands trembled. He reached into his back pocket without thinking and pulled out the sleeve. The torn piece of the original coat he had kept all these years. Identical. A perfect match. They stood in silence, two men separated by years and storms bound by fabric and memory. "I've been looking for you," Kwabena said. Kai looked up slowly. "I don't understand. I didn't remember. Not at first. The accident erased everything. But your face, your voice, the rain. They came back, in flashes, in dreams. I saw you in everything. And then one day, I remembered it all. The blood, the storm, your back straining under my weight, your voice whispering hope when no one else stopped." Kai swallowed. I didn't think you survived." Kwabena smiled, broken, humble. "I didn't think I'd find you." Kai looked away, bars burning the corners of his eyes. "I didn't do it for anything. I couldn't leave you." "I know." Silence again. Thick, heavy, beautiful. And then Kwabena stepped forward slowly, like approaching a flame that might vanish. "May I?" he asked, pointing to Kai's hand. Kai nodded. Kwabena reached out and pressed something into his palm. A key. Heavy, brass, simple. "That's to the apartment above my workshop downtown," he said. "It's yours. I want you there. Safe, dry, alive." Kai stared. Kwabena continued, his voice softer now. "You didn't just save my life. You reminded me who I was and who I want to be." Kai finally looked him in the eye. And for the first time since that night, 7 years ago, he smiled. Dinner was not what Kai expected. It wasn't served by maids or set on a long, polished table beneath chandeliers. There was no silverware laid out like museum pieces or imported wine bottles flaunted for status. Instead, it was quiet, simple, comfortable. Kwabena led Kai to a small side room near the back of the mansion. its walls lined with books, the air heavy with old leather and memory. A square table sat in the center, 2 chairs, a woven cloth across the top, and 2 steaming bowls of jollof rice with grilled tilapia and fried plantains. No servers, just the 2 of them. I cook sometimes when I need to think, Kwabena said as he sat. Tonight, I needed to think. Kai hesitated, unsure of where to sit, unsure if this was still real. Please, Kwabena gestured, sit. You carried me in the rain. Let me feed you in peace. Kai lowered himself into the seat, slowly, his eyes still studying everything, like he might wake up back in Asuboi if he blinked too hard. The first bite sent warmth through his entire body. The fish was tender, smoky. The rice had just the right heat. But it wasn't the food that made him want to cry. It was the stillness, the safety, the knowing someone had waited 7 years just to share this table with him. They ate in silence for a few moments. Then Kwabena set his spoon down and leaned back. I didn't just lose my memory that night, he said quietly. I lost time. I lost control. And for a while, I lost myself. Kai looked up, listening. They told me I was found in a clinic outside Kumasi. Head trauma, blood loss. When I woke, I didn't even know my name. I couldn't recall how to sign my own signature. Couldn't tell a nurse my age. I was a stranger to myself. He paused, eyes distant. But there was one thing I remembered. One image that never left me. Kai didn't move. A boy, Kwabena said. Soaked to the skin. Holding me up with arms that should have broken under the weight. A blue raincoat. And eyes. Eyes that told me I wasn't allowed to die. Kai's fingers curled lightly around his spoon. I didn't know who you were. I couldn't even speak your name. But I dreamed about you. Every week. Every night sometimes. Even when I got better, even when I returned to Accra and everyone celebrated like I'd risen from the dead. I kept seeing you. You were the only piece that stayed. Kai spoke softly. But I didn't even tell anyone. I left before you woke. Kwabena smiled. Doesn't matter. You stayed when it counted. He stood, walked to a cabinet against the far wall, and pulled out a small wooden box. He returned to the table and opened it carefully. Inside, under layers of neatly folded cloth, was a single piece of paper, a sketch. Pencil on heavy stock paper, faded but precise. The lines were delicate, intentional. The face, young, tired, determined, was unmistakable. It was Kai. Younger, wetter. Shoulders hunched, rain dripping from his jaw, but eyes locked forward like a lighthouse, refusing to blink. Kai stared at it, stunned. You drew this? Kwabena chuckled. No. I paid an artist. I sat with him for hours describing what I remembered. Every detail. I must have driven him mad. We tried 30 sketches before I said, that's him. And even then I wasn't sure. Not fully. Why? Because I needed to know you were real. That I hadn't imagined you to cope. Kai leaned back, breath caught in his throat. All these years, I thought you forgot. I never stopped remembering. There was a pause. Then Kai said almost defensively, I didn't do it to be remembered. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I know, Kwabena said. That's why you are one. Kai looked away, his face flushing. I only did what was right. Kwabena's eyes softened. No, you did what others refused to do. You acted when grown men turned their backs. When educated, well-dressed people pretended not to see. You were 13. And you carried a dying man through 3 kilometers of storm. He leaned forward. You didn't just save me, Kai. You saved my company, my people, my family. Ghana doesn't know it, but you saved them from Owusu. Kai frowned. Owusu. Kwabena nodded slowly, anger simmering just beneath the surface. My second in command. Trusted, polished, ambitious in all the wrong ways. The moment I disappeared, he took power. Said I was unfit. He forged documents, shifted contracts, started selling pieces of BrightStream to foreign buyers. Kai's eyes widened. If I had stayed gone another week, Kwabena continued, he would have split the company into 3 shells, cashed out the tech infrastructure to Dubai, and walked away with half the nation's bandwidth in his pocket. He exhaled. But I came back because of you. Kai shook his head. I didn't know any of that. I just did what was right. Kwabena finished for him. Yes. And sometimes doing what's right is all it takes to hold the world together. Kai looked down, trying to steady himself. Kwabena pushed the sketch across the table. I kept this with me every day. Even when the board thought I'd lost it. Even when my assistants told me to let go. I carried this. Kai picked it up slowly, hands trembling. I've searched for you in every city. Sent quiet messages to clinics, orphanages, street schools. I even had a team scan local CCTV archives from that month, looking for a barefoot boy with a blue coat. We came up empty. Kai finally spoke. You found me by accident. Kwabena shook his head. I don't believe in accidents. He leaned forward. I believe in echoes. In unfinished stories. And in the kind of people who don't leave when it's easier to walk away. Kai felt something catch in his throat. Do you know, Kwabena added gently, that one of the doctors who operated on me now runs a trauma program funded by BrightStream, that the clinic in Ayigya has a solar-powered wing, that the boy who once carried me in silence has already changed more lives than he'll ever meet. Kai blinked fast, fighting the emotion rising in his chest. You don't need to give me anything, he said finally. I'm okay. Kwabena smiled, but his eyes stayed serious. I'm not giving you anything, Kai. I'm returning something that always belonged to you, your story, your dignity, your place. There was a long silence, the kind that stretches not from awkwardness, but from reverence. 2 lives, one of power, one of survival, braided by a single act of humanity, sitting at a table between worlds. Kwabena reached across the table. Kai took his hand, and for the first time, neither of them was alone. The storm that had been 7 years in the making now stood at the edge of glass towers. It started not with fire or fury, but with a plan. Kwabena and Kai sat in the back room of a quiet restaurant in Adabraka. Their voices low, the air dense with anticipation. A manila folder lay on the table between them, thin, unassuming, yet packed with proof emails intercepted by a loyal IT analyst, forged signatures cross-referenced by handwriting experts, offshore wire transfers, masked through dummy charities. Owusu had been clever, but he'd forgotten one thing. Dead men don't stay dead when the truth can walk into a boardroom. Kwabena placed a finger on the folder. This isn't about revenge, he said, voice steady. It's about restoring what was almost stolen. Not just from me. From the people who believed in this company. From a nation that relies on its backbone. Kai nodded. He had no suit, no credentials. But what he had was weight. Truth. And a face that Owusu could never explain away. I'm ready, he said. Kwabena smiled, not the kind of smile that reached the lips, but the one that blooms quietly behind the eyes when a storm begins to obey your will. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled for Friday morning, 10 a.m. sharp, inside BrightStream's executive auditorium, an angular glass and steel chamber perched on the 17th floor of the headquarters. Owusu had planned it meticulously. Press releases had already been drafted. A transition announcement framed around leadership continuity in a challenging digital age. Coffee catered, stock reports stacked, everything timed like a coronation, clean, quiet, bloodless. The boardroom itself was filled with men and women in pressed suits, their faces smooth with indifference. Owusu stood at the head of the table, dressed in ash gray, radiating confidence. Behind him, a digital screen displayed the new company vision, aggressive expansion, reduced local investment, international licensing partnerships. The language of pillage wrapped in professional polish. Ladies and gentlemen, Owusu said, clicking the remote to move the slides forward, the time has come for BrightStream to evolve beyond legacy leadership. We honor the past, of course, but we cannot cling to it. The world is watching Africa's tech leap forward, and I propose we be the ones to lead that charge strategically, globally, and independently. There was a polite nod from one of the investors. Another shifted in their chair. No one noticed the 2 figures entering quietly from the side hallway. 2 silhouettes that didn't belong in polished wood and polished lies. Kai in a clean button-down shirt and his only good pair of shoes. Kwabena no longer a ghost, no longer a whisper, a live, upright whole. At first no one saw them. Then a woman gasped. A man near the back dropped his pen. Owusu froze. The silence fell hard. Kwabena stepped forward, Voice calm, clear, the kind of voice that settles hurricanes. I believe this meeting began without me. All eyes turned. No one moved. Owusu blinked, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "Kwabena," he said slowly, What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning," Kwabena replied, walking toward the head of the table, "is that I'm alive. I'm well. And I've come to collect what you tried to bury." He placed the manila folder in front of the closest board member. "This contains documentation of Mr. Owusu's deliberate misrepresentation of my condition, the unauthorized restructuring of our investment portfolios and personal financial gain through shell corporations linked to contracts he approved without oversight." Owusu laughed, sharp, brittle. "This is absurd. Anyone can make up a folder of accusations." "You disappeared. We all thought. You didn't think." Kwabena snapped, the calm cracking just enough to reveal fire beneath. "You planned. You saw an opening and took it." The room held its breath. A lawyer from legal cleared her throat. "If Mr. Mensah is truly back, we'll need confirmation. Identification, medical clearance, witness statements." Kwabena turned to Kai, and for the first time, all eyes truly saw him. "This is Kai," he said. 7 years ago, when no one else would stop, this boy carried me through a monsoon and saved my life. He brought me to a clinic when my own executives wouldn't even check if I was breathing. And then he disappeared." Kai stood straighter. "I was there," he said simply. "I carried him. I watched him bleed. I left before anyone knew who I was, because I didn't want anything. But I never forgot. He reached into his backpack and pulled out the torn sleeve of the blue raincoat, the same one he had kept all these years. He unfolded it gently, laying it on the table like a relic. Kwabena held up the sketch. The room was still, too still. Owusu stepped forward, anger creeping into his voice. "This is a show. This is sentimentality. This is not business." "No," Kwabena said, voice hard now. "This is justice." The room erupted into murmurs. A board member stood. "We'll need to verify everything, of course. But if Mr. Mensah is indeed alive and able..." Another, "The contracts. If those transfers are real..." Owusu's face began to pale. For the first time, he looked like a man whose chessboard had betrayed him. "You think they'll believe a street kid?" He sneered at Kai. "You think your story means more than corporate structure?" Kai didn't flinch. "I think doing what's right," he said, "always outlives what's clever." Kwabena turned to the board. "You don't have to make a decision now. But understand this, I'm not asking to reclaim power. I'm reclaiming the truth. What you do with it next will define who this company becomes." There was a long silence. Then the chairman, a stoic woman with silver braids, closed her laptop softly. "We'll convene an emergency review," she said, effective immediately. Owusu's breath caught. Kwabena turned, motioned to Kai. Together they walked out, not to applause, not to cheers, but to something heavier. The first morning light slipped through the blinds like an old friend. It touched the edge of the raincoat hanging on the wall, casting a blue shadow across the polished floor. Kai sat at the breakfast table, his hands wrapped around a mug of steaming tea. He hadn't spoken much since the boardroom. Part of him still lived in disbelief. That just days ago, he had been crawling under kiosks to fix faulty sockets, and now he had stood in a boardroom that controlled the pulse of a nation. Kwabena walked in from the terrace, a soft smile on his face. He was dressed in a simple linen shirt, holding 2 envelopes in his hand, one thick sealed, the other thin open. He set them down on the table. "I've been thinking," he said gently. "You didn't ask for anything, Kai. Not back then, not now. But I believe when the universe balances its books, it needs to leave a receipt." Kai smiled faintly, but said nothing. Kwabena pushed the thick envelope forward. "Inside this is the deed to a house. Not a mansion, but a home in East Legan. Close to the city, clean water, good schools nearby, fully paid." Kai's eyes didn't move. "And this," Kwabena continued, tapping the second envelope, "is a cashier's check. 50,000 cedis." I asked myself what your life might have looked like if that night never happened, if someone had caught you before the street did. Maybe this helps close that gap. Kai looked up slowly. The steam from his cup curled like smoke between them. He stared at the envelope for a long while. Then he pushed both back gently. I can't take that, he said softly. Kwabena blinked. You've earned it. No, Kai said. I haven't, not yet. He leaned forward, his voice steady. That night I didn't carry you for a reward. I carried you because no one else would. I didn't want money. I still don't. Kwabena tilted his head. Then what do you want? Kai hesitated. Then he opened his hand. There, still folded, still worn, was the sleeve of the raincoat. I want to be someone worthy of this, he said. This coat, it reminds me of who I tried to be when I had nothing. I want to be that person even now. Kwabena's face changed. Something deep cracked open behind his eyes, something old and unspoken. You are already that person, he said quietly. No, Kai replied. Not yet. But I'm ready to try. The room fell into reverent silence. And then Kwabena smiled, not out of pride, not out of relief, but out of awe. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a different envelope, small square with a company seal on the front. This, he said, handing it over, is not charity. It's an offer. Kai took it and opened it slowly. Inside was a contract. Kai's lips parted slightly, eyes scanning the words over and over like they might vanish if he blinked. I've had this idea sitting in my files for years, Kwabena said. But the board never backed it. Too expensive, not profitable. I shelved it again and again, but now, he gestured toward Kai. I've got a reason to dust it off. Kai looked up. Electricity shouldn't be a privilege, Kwabena continued. And I think you, of all people, understand what it means to light up the dark. The raincoat sleeve rested between them on the table, 2 lives folded into one. Later that day, they drove together to the Renewables Division headquarters, Kai in the front seat, quiet, focused. No more wide eyes. No more disbelief. He belonged now. The building was smaller than the tech tower downtown, but it buzzed with purpose. Inside, engineers, environmental planners, and solar architects shuffled across workstations stacked with blueprints and lithium battery prototypes. Kwabena walked him through the team like a proud father, introducing a son to the family he'd never met. This is Kai, he said. He's leading the next chapter. Some stared, unsure of the name, the face, the resume that didn't exist. But others, especially the ones who had read the quiet memo from legal that morning, recognized the weight in Kwabena's voice. And they nodded. Warmly, like a space had been waiting, a space shaped exactly like Kai. The weeks that followed were filled with dust and sun. Kai rode trucks into villages where lanterns still burned whale oil. He helped install panels on mud roofs, taught children to flip the right switches, listened to elders bless the wires as if they were prayers. He worked with calloused hands. He learned how to log battery draw on spreadsheets. He spent hours asking questions no one expected from someone without a degree. And every night he folded the raincoat sleeve into his pocket before he slept, still a boy. In many ways, still carrying the storm. One evening, after installing the first microgrid in a small village outside Baku, an old woman held his hand and asked, "What did they pay you to bring us light?" Kai smiled. "Not enough," he said, "but just right." In Accra, Kwabena stood in his office, watching the sunset behind his towers. A photo sat on his desk now, a simple one. 2 men standing beside a solar panel, one in a white shirt, one in a dusty cap, both laughing. He touched the corner of the frame, then turned back to his laptop. The world outside could keep chasing gold, but for him, everything changed the night a boy chose light over silence and gave it away. Not for glory, not for praise, but because kindness, when given freely, shines forever. The road to the village was more memory than map. It twisted through red earth and broken stone, past rusted signposts, abandoned tractors, and overgrown fields where children once played before migration, and silence emptied the homes. No one had spoken the village's name on national radio in decades. It didn't appear in tourism brochures or economic reports, but it lived in Kai's bones. This was where his mother had grown up, before sickness took her, before the city took him, before the world turned cold and left him scavenging beneath buses and sleeping beneath stars that never blinked back. Now he was returning not as a beggar, not as a ghost, but as someone who could give something back. Power, light, hope. The final transformer stood at the edge of the village square, surrounded by rows of solar panels, gleaming in the sun like polished wings. Children watched curiously as Kai connected the last terminal. His hands moved with quiet confidence, measured, grounded. These were no longer the hands of a scavenger. These were the hands of someone building something that would last beyond him. A low hum began to vibrate in the soil beneath their feet. A second later, the lights flickered on. One bulb, then another. Then the whole schoolhouse lit up like morning. There was silence. Then an eruption of cheers. Children clapped. Elders wept. Mothers dropped water basins and held their faces in their hands as if seeing a miracle. Kai stood still, letting the sound wash over him. He wasn't used to celebration, but he understood what this meant. For the first time in living memory, the village had power. At night, children could read. Families could refrigerate food. Radios could tell stories. Phones could charge. And candles would no longer be the only thing standing between hope and darkness. He looked down at his hands and whispered, "Mama, we're home." Later that afternoon, the inauguration ceremony began beneath a giant baobab tree at the center of the village. There were no podiums, no TV crews. Just wooden stools, plastic chairs, and human hearts beating with shared purpose. Kwabena arrived just before the speeches began, stepping out of a four-wheel truck in a white linen tunic, simple but elegant. His presence turned heads, not because of who he was, but because of who he came with. He walked straight to Kai and embraced him in front of everyone. "I wouldn't have missed this for anything," he said. Kai smiled shyly, unused to public affection. "It's just a village." "No," Kwabena said. "It's the beginning of something much bigger." He looked around at the faces. These children are going to remember this moment for the rest of their lives. A girl no older than 9 approached them holding a tiny notebook. "Please," she asked, eyes bright. "Can I read under the light tonight?" Kwabena knelt down, tears welling in his eyes. "That's why we built it." She grinned and ran back toward the schoolhouse, her braids bouncing behind her like joy-given wings. Kai watched her disappear, then turned to Kwabena. "There are so many like her." "I know, and not just here. Tamale, Tekiman, Ketekrachi, the slums in Agbogbloshi. Hundreds of kids, some without homes, some too hungry to even ask for help." Kwabena nodded, his expression sobering. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "About how to take what we've started and make it something permanent. Something that reaches beyond wires and switches." He pulled a folded document from his pocket. Kai took it, read the title, and paused. "The Blue Raincoat Foundation, Vocational Hope for Ghana's Forgotten Children." He looked up, stunned. "I want us to launch this together," Kwabena said. "We start with what we know: electricity, apprenticeships, real skills. We partner with vocational schools, sponsor shelter programs, give them tools and mentors, let them build their way out like you did." Kai's throat tightened. "This will be bigger than me," he whispered. Kwabena placed a hand on his shoulder. "Exactly. It was never just about us." The ceremony began. A local chief said a prayer. Children performed a dance. A goat was gifted in thanks. And when Kai was called to speak, he stood awkwardly before the crowd, unsure what to say. He looked at the children first, their eyes wide, full of the kind of belief that could tear down mountains. Then he looked up at the light poles, humming gently against the sky. "I don't have many words," he said softly, his voice shaking just a little. "But I know what darkness feels like. I know what it means when nobody comes." He paused. "But now we're coming, for all of you." A single clap broke the silence, then another, then a roar, not for a celebrity, not for a hero, but for a man who remembered where he came from and chose to return with something more than memory. That night, as they drove away, Kwabena glanced at Kai in the passenger seat. "You're quiet." "I'm thinking," Kai said. "About what?" Kai stared out the window. "The day I gave you that raincoat, I thought I'd lost the only thing that ever kept me safe." He turned back, eyes moist but clear. "But I didn't lose it. It just changed shape." Kwabena nodded slowly, a tear tracing the corner of his mouth. The headlights cut through the night as they passed under the stars, 2 men, 1 storm, and a future lit by something more powerful than light. The rain returned like an old friend, soft, steady, uninvited, but not unwelcome. Kai sat by the window of his modest flat above the solar workshop. Outside, the rooftops shimmered with silver droplets slipping down gutters like threads of memory, unraveling gently into the night. The glow of warm lamplight inside cast a halo on the glass, framing his reflection against the dark, wet world beyond. On the wall across from him, perfectly centered in a custom wooden frame, hung the faded blue raincoat. It no longer sagged in sadness or smelled of the streets. It was preserved carefully flattened, the edges hand-stitched onto cloth. Backing the collar turned just enough to suggest dignity rather than damage. The torn sleeve had been stitched back onto the coat's shoulder. Together again after years of separation. It wasn't just fabric. It was story. It was the storm, the choice, the burden, and the boy who never gave up. Kai's hand rested on the windowsill, fingertips lightly tapping in rhythm with the raindrops. His body had grown stronger, his shoulders wider, but there was still something inward about him. Something still boyish in the way he listened to silence. Not as a void, but as a teacher. The silence was interrupted by a knock. Gentle, delicate, followed by a giggle. He smiled before he even turned. Opening the door, he found Zawadi standing there, umbrella in one hand, a folded envelope in the other. She was 11 now, taller than before, with those same bright eyes that never missed a thing. "Uncle Kai," she grinned. "Daddy said I had to dress nice to bring this to you. I even wore my good shoes." Kai stepped aside, gesturing dramatically. "Please enter with honor." She curtsied playfully, then marched in with the command of a princess on a mission. She set the envelope on the table, then pointed at the raincoat on the wall. "Mom says when I'm old enough, I'll write an essay about that coat." Kai laughed. "What would you say?" "That a boy who had nothing gave it away." That's what made it magic. He looked at her, genuinely moved. Zawadi ran to the table, opening the envelope. "It's a dinner invitation Daddy's cooking. Mama's setting the table. And I drew the place cards." She handed him a small piece of cardboard with Big Brother Kai written in marker, half the letters dancing off the edges. His throat tightened. "Big brother, huh?" he said. She nodded. "Well, you're not really my brother, but you kind of saved my life before I was born. So that's even bigger, right?" He knelt down eye level with her. "I'd be honored," he said. She hugged him tightly, and for a moment he let himself feel all of it, the years, the rain, the weight, the loneliness, and now the light, the healing, the home. Later that evening, after Zawadi left, bouncing down the stairwell, Kai stood once more before the framed coat. He placed a palm against the glass. So many nights he had stared at it and wondered if it had been the peak of his life. If that one act of kindness had been his only light in a world that mostly forgot people like him. But now he understood something deeper. That kindness never ends at the edge of a storm. It becomes something else, echoes, bridges, homes, people. He whispered something then, too soft to hear, and turned off the light. As he stepped out into the rain, pulling his jacket tight around him, a neighbor called from across the street, "Tai." The light in Block C went out again. He smiled. "Tomorrow, Madam Esther. Tonight I've got family to feed me." And he laughed, not the guarded laugh of a boy who feared the next moment, but the full open sound of a man who had returned from hunger, from anonymity, from absence, and knew who he was. The rain danced on his shoulders like applause, and as he walked away, his voice floated back through the drizzle, quiet, steady, full of peace. "I'm not rich, but I've never lacked the most important thing, a good heart." The screen fades into a slow-motion shot of rain falling gently over a quiet city street. In the window of a humble apartment above a solar workshop, a blue raincoat hangs inside a glass frame lit, not by spotlight, but by the soft golden glow of dawn. A voice enters, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and human. The narrator, in a world often fueled by profit, performance, and pride. It's easy to forget the power of small things. The camera pans over flashbacks. A young boy running barefoot through flooded alleys. A man unconscious beneath a sheet of rusted metal, a trembling hand offering food, and a child's smile under the glow of a new light bulb. But sometimes, one gesture, one choice, one quiet moment of compassion can echo through the years like thunder beneath the skin. A slow dissolve brings back the image of Kai standing beside a child, holding a light switch as an entire village illuminates behind him. That boy had nothing. No shoes, no name worth remembering, just a tattered blue coat and the courage to act when others looked away. Pause, and from that moment, an empire was saved. A family was born, and forgotten children were given a future no one thought they deserved. The frame shifts to Kai walking down a wet road, smiling as children wave from the doorways. You don't have to be rich to change someone's life. You don't have to have a title or a degree or even a plan. You just have to care enough to stop, to stay, to act. The narrator's voice lowers slightly intimate. Because sometimes, a blue raincoat isn't just a shield from the storm, it's a promise. Final shot, a handwritten plaque beneath the framed coat reading, "To the boy who carried a stranger, and to the man who carried his kindness into the world." Fade to black, one last line before the silence returns. You don't need much to be someone's miracle. You just need to show up when it matters.